I'd like to turn your attention this morning for a few minutes to the book of Genesis, chapter 12. In the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis, we are introduced to some of the most remarkable things that history knows. You have the creation of the world in the first chapter and the introduction to the first human family of Adam and Eve in the first three chapters of the book. We are introduced at some point to the fall of man within those chapters. You're introduced in about chapters 6 through 9, to the flood and destruction of this world the first time. You're introduced in chapter 11, or the beginning of chapter 11, to a place called the Tower of Babel, where the Lord confuses or confounds the languages. There's some pretty remarkable questions that could be asked about those events within this book, and that the Lord just kind of brushes over it very quickly and kind of sweeps over it very quickly, as if to say, no big deal. But then you get to chapter 12, and the Lord just kind of puts the brakes on. And through the rest of the book of Genesis, you have a narrative on the family of a man named Abraham. I think I have a lot more questions or a lot more curiosity about the creation and about the flood and about the fall and about the Tower of Babel and the separating of human beings across the planet than I do about just one man's family. However, I think the history that is written here beginning in chapter 12 about one man's family probably is more important to us, or probably should be more important to us, which is why one of the reasons I think the Lord kind of slows down and takes his time when he introduces us to a man named Abraham. Now, it is true that he begins out in chapter 12 of verse 1 calling him Abram. I will no doubt interchange and confuse the names of Abram and Abraham throughout this sermon. Forgive me, I apologize in advance. But in reading through chapter 12 a little bit this week, there was a scenario that kind of jumped out at me. There's a pattern that is laid out here for me in Genesis chapter 12 that will extend for 4 generations. I remember many years ago, when I was much younger, that there was a time where I could somewhat look at points in my life, look at things that had occurred in my life, and they almost, without fail, paralleled events in the life of my own earthly father. I'm talking about the way we thought, the way we acted, the way we write things on paper, to the jobs that I had, to the jobs that I didn't have, and for the same reasons I didn't have those jobs. And it kind of gets a bit scary to start with. Now, obviously, my life has kind of taken a bit of a different turn than his, but nonetheless, either through effort or by coincidence, we see a parallel in my life, or I see a parallel in my life with the life of my father. You may have the same thing with your father or with your mother, whatever the case may be. But nonetheless, there is a situation that occurs in the book of Genesis that you can trace throughout the scriptures, that it's almost that the Scriptures are very deliberate. When they come to this, they say, this occurred. So, for example, something that we will look at here in a minute, there are 4 generations in Abraham's family. There's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. So Abraham, his son Isaac, his son Jacob, and then his son Joseph. All 4 of them encounter a famine in the land. In Abraham's situation, that we may or may not get into much about this, but we all know the story of Abraham, how he went down into Egypt and he told them that Sarah was not his wife, Sarah was his sister. That's kind of the story that's laid out. It's laid out here for us in Genesis. Abraham does that twice. He does that for Pharaoh down in Egypt, and then a little later on in Abraham's life, he goes down into the land of Gerar, which is the land of the Philistines, and he tells Abimelech that Sarah is his sister and not his wife. Now, keep in mind that what Abraham is saying there is a half-truth. Abraham is his sister. Sarah is Abraham's sister. She's his half-sister. They both have the same father, but they have different mothers. So it's a half-truth. But it's a story told from Abraham's selfish point of view. It's told twice. Once to Pharaoh, once to Abimelech. And then as you read through Genesis, you'll come across his son Isaac, who goes down into Gerar to the same Abimelech and tells him the same story. Now, whether Abraham told this story to Isaac and Isaac just happened to remember it, or whether Isaac just had the same personality as his father, not clear from the Scriptures. But it is interesting to note that Abraham, he's not called the father of the faithful in the Bible. That's sort of a term that human beings have laid upon him. He is called the father of faith or the father of the faithful by human beings. He was a faithful man. The Bible does call him the friend of God. And that he was just like you and me at times. He had a hard time distinguishing between being the friend of God and being the friend of the world. So Abraham and Isaac have this very, very specific situation of telling the same lying story, I guess is what I'm kind of getting around to here. But if you've read anything about the Bible and you've read anything about Isaac's son Jacob, Jacob didn't tell any king or any pharaoh a lying story about, this woman is my sister, right? Jacob's just flat out liar. I mean, he at some point in his life, he'd rather lie to you than tell the truth. Throughout the situation of both Abraham and Isaac, when they get down into foreign lands and they tell these ridiculous stories, both of them essentially make a fool of themselves. They make a mess of their life. And it takes a 4th generation individual in Joseph to go down into Egypt to actually make a difference in some foreign person's life. In Genesis chapter 12, beginning with the first verse, it says, "The Lord had said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed. So Abraham departed, as the Lord had spoken unto him. And Lot went with him. And Abraham was 75 years old when he departed out of Haran. And Abraham took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their substance that they had gathered, and the souls that they had gotten in Haran. And they went forth to go into the land of Canaan, and into the land of Canaan they came. Now, if you're reading this and you're thinking about the process that Abraham is going through at this point, the first question that you may come up with is, when God told him in verse 1 to leave thy country, leave thy kindred, and leave thy father's house, what kind of idea comes to your mind? To my mind, is just sort of an individual maybe packing a backpack and he's gone. By himself. But that's not what Abraham does. Now, I do not fault Sarah for going with Abraham. She's his wife. It's what she should have done. The question is why did he take Lot? And why did he take other people with him? Because that's not technically what God said. But that's my question. The Bible does not address that situation. Maybe I'm stirring up a hornet's nest. But you do know, if you read through these passages, that with Lot going with him, that became a source of contention and trouble a little later on down the road. And part of that, though, is Abraham's fault. See, there's a pattern that's laid out in chapter 12, and the first thing is, the first dreadful thing that occurs is a famine comes in the land. So when the famine comes in the land, then Abraham, the father of the family, has to make a decision. I'll go ahead and let you in on this secret. The father fails the family. And when the father fails the family, the third thing that happens is the family suffers. This is not a very good Father's Day sermon. It's a good thing this is not Father's Day. Oh boy, wait till Mother's Day. Oh, that's next week, isn't it? But just look at it. A famine comes. A father fails. And a family suffers. If you're an individual with any amount of sense at all, you've spent some time looking at your decisions in life. You've spent some time looking at places you've been and the things that you've done. And if you got any sense in life or any sense about yourself, you'll probably lay down tonight with more regrets than anything. The problem with that concept of constantly looking at your regrets is that the Lord says in the book of Luke, I believe it is, he that puts his hand to the plow and looketh back is not worthy of the kingdom. So, if you've got a farmer who's got a mule and a plow in front of him, and he's got a handheld plow, if he spends his whole time with the mule going one way and his head going the other direction, the lines that are being dug aren't going to be very straight. And if you spend more of your life trying to have a perfect future by fixing the past, that's never really going to happen. But I think the life of Abraham at least is worth us considering from that standpoint. I like the way the Lord spoke to Abram in the beginning of this chapter. Who doesn't, right? I will make of thee a great nation. I will bless thee. I will make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. Who wouldn't want to hear that? Who of us would not want to come to church and have the preacher say to us, I will make thee great? Well, if the Lord came to me and said that, I believe I'd pack my bags and leave also. Sarah leaves the place that they're at. The place that they're at is called the Ur of Chaldees. Abraham by birth was a Babylonian. He was a pagan, is what he was. And by his natural birth, he was a pagan. Don't that sound familiar? By nature, you're pagans. By nature, you're sinners. But through the calling of God, we're called out of one homeland and we are going to another. But that's a story for another time. Abraham has to go somewhere that God hasn't informed him of yet. Don't y'all introverts just really like that? Don't all of y'all introverts in here just really like the fact we're going somewhere and we don't know where we're going? The late comedian Jeannie Robertson, wonderful lady, funny lady, she had a weird husband. His name was Jerry, but she called him left brain. And if you know anything about the way that right brain people think and the way that left brain people think, if you don't know anything about it, when I get done with this, you will. Shortly after they got married, or best I can remember how she told the story, she had a speaking engagement. She lived in North Carolina and she had a speaking engagement at another place. And so they were just going to drive and just sort of meander their way from point A to point B and kind of enjoy the ride on the way. And we're just going to kind of meander. Now, those of us who are free spirits and those of us who are extroverted and those of us who are frankly irresponsible and couldn't care less of what time of day it is, don't mind the word meander. I guess I could say meander gonna go somewhere, but maybe that's what that meant. Maybe that's where it came from. So she goes on about her day, and then every night she realized that left brain is sitting at the table with a map and a phone book back in those days, and telephone, and he's making calls and he's doing this. She's like, "What are you doing?" He says, I am plotting out our course of travel. She says, "No, we're just going to meander. We don't know where we're going to be at night." He says, "I know exactly where I'm going to be. I'm going to be where I made these hotel reservations." And there's some of y'all in here, you just like that. You got to know where you're going. I married a woman who's just like that. I'm not throwing her under the bus because I'm the person that would meander. I'd make it up as I go along. Sometimes that doesn't work, by the way. I will take the blame for that. I had a preaching appointment one time in Chattanooga, actually, before we got married. And we're planning our wedding, and I'm sitting at her mother and father's dining room table, and I'm doing whatever I was doing back then. I don't know, wrapping birdseed or printing out documents or whatever. And they're like, don't you have to be in Chattanooga this afternoon? It's just only a 2-hour drive. Plenty of time. Have you made hotel reservations? Don't need them. It's Chattanooga. Do need them. It's Chattanooga. And I get up there and some big shindig is going on in the city. And every hotel I went to was booked. And I couldn't get in touch with anybody at the church because this was before cell phones. And you couldn't just get somebody on a whim and a last minute notice. And I finally found one desk clerk at a hotel who says, I'll clear you out our storage room and I'll lay down a mattress and you can sleep there if you'd like. Fantastic. And that's what I did. And I meandered right to a storage room and slept for the night. And you think that had taught me a lesson? Now, but Abraham's okay. Abraham's just going to meander. Sarah's along for the ride. Here's the point. Abraham's going to begin this journey trusting God, right? As well he should, right? Sarah's going to begin this journey. She's going to have to trust her husband. Well, that don't always work out, does it? Abraham gets this great message, I will bless thee, thou shalt be blessed. And then he says in verse 7 that the Lord appeared unto Abram and said, unto thy seed will I give this land. Now at this point, as far as Abraham and Sarah are concerned, they have no children. And for a good many years, Abraham and Sarah have no children. I think at this point she's somewhere around 65 at this point in her life. Well, it says that Abraham was 75. Let me back up. Yeah, verse 4 says Abraham was 75. And there's a 10-year difference or so between them. So she's about 65. And for the next 25, 30 years, they go childless. And yet God has said, I will give to thy seed this land. Whole bunch of promises going on here, right? Whole bunch of encouragement, right? I mean, I don't think there's any one of us in here who'd look at any of these promises, look at these first 7 verses of this chapter and say, this is the dumbest thing I've ever heard of. I'm staying home. And not a one of us says that. Everybody look at this and say, this is great. This is fantastic. This is going to work out wonderful. We're never going to have a problem. And so here in verse 7, what happens? You see a characteristic in Abraham pop out. And this is something you can trace through the life of Abraham, that it says, and there builded he an altar unto the Lord who appeared unto him. Wow, this is fantastic. Wonderful. And then he moved from there, notice verse 8, he moved from thence unto a mountain on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west and Hai on the east. And there he builded an altar unto the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. This is wonderful. Abraham has the characteristic of being an altar builder. It's not only here that it's mentioned that he built an altar, it's also mentioned in chapter 13 and verse 4 that has reference to building an altar. Chapter 13 and verse 18 is reference to Abraham building an altar, and I think in chapter 22 and verse 9, when he offers Isaac up on top of the mountain, he builds another altar. So this is a notable characteristic of Abraham. His son Isaac didn't have this same characteristic. He did not build altars, but if you go through and you look at what Isaac did, Isaac digged wells. And there's a heap of preaching and a lot more explanation than what I really want to get into on this. But if you're in a desert land, you ain't got running water, and you don't have Walmart so you can run down and get you a jug every now and then you need one, you got to find the water. And the way you find it is you dig the well. And you got to dig down deep into the ground. And when you find it, you stay there. You dig a well, which from our picture of this is essentially that well becomes the center of town. You know the old Western movies where they ride in on horseback and they always come up to the well right in the middle of the town, or to the horse trough that's right there near the well in the middle of the town, or like on the Andy Griffith Show where they've got that honorary Robert E. Lee or something like that horse trough that the fiddling banjo man comes and fills his hat out of that trough. Wow. The Darlings, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you for being a darling. There you go, helping me out. When they digged wells, towns would develop around them. So that's kind of something worth thinking about. Is you have one man building altars where we're worshiping God. You have another man digging wells that creates an encouragement of sustaining of life. Both of those can be emblematic of the church. That the church needs, number one, to have an altar unto God into it, and also the church needs to function in a sense that it supports life around it. Jacob doesn't do any of that. Jacob steals from people, robs people, steals from his blind old dying daddy Isaac. He gets over here and he's got a fight with Laban, who's just as much a horse trader as he is. Joseph, on the other hand, spends the majority of his life in jail. So he doesn't have opportunity to build altars. He doesn't have opportunity to dig wells. He certainly ain't lying to nobody. He gets thrown into jail because his brothers are envious of him. And yet throughout this whole story, nearly everybody, except for Isaac, all wind up in Egypt at some point in their life. Because here now we have, in Genesis chapter 12, Abraham builds these great altars, but then it says in verse 10, and there was a famine in the land. This famine has to be, it has to be pretty remarkable, because I think it's in Isaac's life in chapter 26, the first verse, that it says, and there was a famine in the land beside the first famine that was in the days of Abraham. So there's something pretty remarkable about this. You know, we can say, I can say in my lifetime here in the South, we don't see a whole lot of snow. Right after we moved here, I try and mark things about times and seasons about where I was when it occurred. There was a time since we've been here in Alabama that it snowed once in January for a day, once in February for a day, and once in March for a day. That's pretty odd for us. Now, those of you though that are old enough, you may remember the blizzard of '93. That was something that kind of hit y'all pretty hard here. It missed us in Atlanta. I mean, we got a little sprinkling of it. It wasn't anything about the snow. It wasn't anything like the snow of '84. It was something in '83 or '84 that was. I remember that. We were in third grade, fourth grade. Yeah, and boy, that was something else that day. Shut the whole city down by about 3 o'clock that afternoon there in Atlanta. That was something else. So something happens like that, and you're like, wow, this hasn't happened since that time. So it's very possible that you can have maybe minor little famines. Famines usually come, in an agricultural sense, they come from a drought. The drought occurs first. There's no water. Plants don't grow. Plants don't grow. There's no food to harvest. There's no food to harvest. There's no food to feed people. Famines can come, if you read through the scriptures, because an invading army comes in and sieges your city, and this happens in a reference to this is 2 Kings 25, in the first verse, when Nebuchadnezzar came in and besieged Jerusalem, there was no bread for the people, and they cut off the supply to the people, and there was a great famine in the land. Jesus says that in the last days you shall hear of wars, of rumors, and famines. There's another one that I'll get to in a minute. So the God of glory that has called Abraham out of the Ur of Chaldees and told him these great promises is forgotten about. Because the Bible tells us that there was a famine in the land, and Abraham went down into Egypt. It's interesting that he didn't go down to his altar. He went down into Egypt. In Isaac's day, when Isaac had the famine, it said that Isaac went down into Gerar, which is not in Egypt, but it is still the land of the Philistines. You remember in the book of Ruth, chapter 1, where the Bible says that there was a famine in the land, and a man named Elimelech, who's married to a woman named Naomi, and they have 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. There's a famine in the land there in Israel, and they leave that land and they go down into Moab. Y'all kind of seeing a pattern here a little bit? Abraham, who's called of God and blessed of God, when there's a famine that comes, goes down into Egypt. Isaac, who's blessed of God and called of God, when there's a famine that comes, goes down to the Philistines. Elimelech, who's living in God's place. But he's living in, at this time, if there's a famine in this land and he's living in Bethlehem, he's living in the house of bread. That's what Bethlehem means. It's the house of bread, and yet there's a famine in the land. And so he says, I'm done with this. I'm going to Moab. Well, Moab's, they're enemies of Israel. The Moabites also are the descendants of Lot's children. Y'all remember this? When Lot is brought out of Sodom, there in the latter half of the book of Genesis here, he's brought out of Sodom. His 2 daughters are with him. And they say, well, there's not any other men. We will get our father drunken, and we will lie with him. And one conceives one night, one conceives the next night. One has a son who is the creator of the Amorites, and one has a son who's the creator of the Moabites. Y'all ever had a famine? We ain't never been through a famine. Now, there have been times when the shelves were bare for a few days, but we've never been through a famine. When the Bible says there was a famine in the land, this is not romanticized stories. This is not some 13-year-old girl sitting on her bed writing her diary, "Oh, my life is over. The boy I like didn't look at me today." The Bible is not writing things like that. If the Bible says there was a famine in the land, this is serious. There are no crops. Cattle may be dying. All the people that Abraham brought with him. See, remember I said earlier, he brought a bunch of people with him. He's got so many people with him, by the way. If you want to know just how many people he has, continue reading through these chapters and you read about the slaughter of the kings. Remember when the kings came down and they besieged the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, and they took a bunch of people hostage, and one of the people that those kings took hostage was his nephew Lot. And so the Bible tells us that Abraham armed 300 trained soldiers which were born in his house. I mean, he's a wealthy dude. He's got 300 trained soldiers. I'd venture to say, if you want to know who is he kind of like, he's kind of like the mayor of a small city. That's a fair characteristic, I think. That's a fair parallel. So those 300 people that he needs to arm and go down and slaughter those kings and bring back his nephew Lot, who's going to just turn right around and go back down into Sodom. At this point, you got a bunch of people that are relying on him. And so the first thing he says is, we'll go down to Egypt. Now, I've hammered this a time or two. Do you want to know why it's bad that Abraham went down into Egypt? Well, they've got bread down there, right? I mean, if we were in a famine and you heard somewhere that there was food, wouldn't you go? Well, you got some small children to take care of, wouldn't you go? I got some small children, well, not so small anymore. I got some young children to take care of. Wouldn't you go? So I can't really fault Abraham too much for failing at this point. And that's one thing that we as the church need to learn, we need to understand. People will all the times they will make this statement, "I can't believe that you would do that." You ever said that? Anybody ever said that about you? Why not? Why can't you believe that I would do this? When we make that kind of statement, we let people know that the doctrine of total depravity that we believe, we only believe it in theory. In other words, we read it in the book, that's what it says, and we go on. If you really believe the doctrine of total depravity, then when somebody you love and somebody you know does something foolish and dumb, your comment ought to be, well, I expected you to do worse. At least you didn't go that far. Maybe we could say that. But in Isaiah chapter 31, and verse 1, the Bible tells us why it's a bad thing for Abraham to be down in Egypt. He says, woe to them. This is Isaiah 31 and verse 1. Woe to them that go down to Egypt for help, and stay on horses and trust in chariots, because they are many, and in horsemen, because they are very strong. But they look not unto the Holy One of Israel, neither seek the Lord. So that's why you can look at this and say, this was the wrong thing for Abraham to do. Now, it's very easy for me on this side of the picture to fuss at Abraham and say, Abraham should not have done this thing, right? It's very easy for you and me to open this book up, look at the story that unfolds, look where it started. Actually, I thought about that this morning. I says, we're going to look at how the story unfolds. Maybe we should look at how the story unravels. And it's very easy for you and me to look at how this story unravels and say, well, if I'd have been there, I wouldn't have done that. No, I think if you and I had been there, you and I had done the same thing. He goes down into Egypt, and he tells them that Sarah is not his wife, but she's his sister. Bad things happen in Pharaoh's house. When Pharaoh looks at this situation, he says, okay, well, if she's just your sister, then you won't mind me having her. The very thing that Abraham was trying to avoid is the very thing he got himself into. And so Pharaoh says, well, then you won't mind if I take her. I'll pay you for her. As a matter of fact, you're going to get, in verse 16, sheep and oxen and he-asses and men servants and maid servants and she-asses and camels. Sarah, who followed Abraham, who started out really well. He started out building his altars. He started out praising God. He started out well. He's just like the church at Galatia when Paul said to them, ye did run well. You started well. But then Paul says to that church at Galatia, he says, who did hinder you that you should not obey the truth? There's a lot of us in our Christian journey. You started out well. What happened? Sarah leaves the homeland. She goes off with him. And now she finds herself essentially sold to the world. He sells his wife to the Egyptians. It's like, the story where the man says, hey, I got this bicycle for my wife. And the other man says, that's a pretty good trade. Well, Abraham can come up in verse 16 and say, hey, I got the sheep for my wife. Not only did I get that, I got everything else. All I had to trade is my wife for all these animals. And you got to think that Sarah's probably scratching her head, sitting in the room going, what in the world? How did I get here? Well, there was a famine in the land. And in this case, Abraham started doing things according to the dictates of his flesh. So in other words, Abraham's just like you and me. That when problems come, situations arise, we are very emotional people. And if we are not careful, our emotions will get the best of us. And we do, in a situation, what we feel like doing instead of doing what God has told us to do. I think it's very true when you take the Bible as a whole, all 66 books of this great volume, this library here, and you read and you see that God that spoke the world out of nothing, God that rained down manna from heaven 6 days a week for 40 years, God that made water flow from a rock, God that healed the sick, cleansed the lepers, and raised the dead, could have solved Abraham's problem. Which means he can solve my problems. Question is am I willing to let him solve my earthly problems? Sometimes we're not. There's a famine in the land and he goes down into Egypt. There's a famine in Isaac's day. He goes down to Gerar. And then in the latter portion of Genesis, chapter 41, the entire chapter of Genesis 41 is about a dream that Pharaoh has. And Pharaoh has that dream of the fat cows and the skinny cows. And the fat cows are feasting and the skinny cows come out and they eat up the fat cows. And essentially, Joseph comes and tells him, well, God has given you a dream. He's giving you a double dream because there's going to come 7 years of plenty, 7 years of prosperity, followed by 7 years of famine. You better prepare for the famine. And Pharaoh says, great, you do it. Huh? Yeah, you do it. I'd have never in my life thought that this little boy that got sold into slavery at about 13, 14 years old by his brothers would wind up second in command in Egypt. But that's the way God worked it. You know, sometimes when there's problems, sometimes when there's a famine in the land, we're not really concerned about the future. When there's a famine in the land, I'm not concerned about vacation in 6 months. I'm not concerned about the end of my 401k. I'm not concerned about retirement. I'm not concerned about this, that, and another. When there's a famine in the land, I'm concerned about right now. Because if I don't get food in the next few days, we're going to have problems. Now, it is true that there were people in the Bible that fasted for a certain period of time. There were people that fasted for a day. There were people that fasted for a week. There are people that fasted for a couple of weeks. There are people that fasted for 40 days. Those 40-day fastings are supernatural fastings, by the way. If you're going to plan a fast, you better plan ahead. But I don't know anybody that fasted for months and years, because there comes a point where the famine will destroy you. And the tendency sometimes amongst these people in the Bible was when the famine came, we're going to fix it immediately ourselves. Have you ever noticed in the book of Luke, in chapter 15, when the Lord tells the parable of the prodigal son, you ever notice what happened to him? The prodigal son comes to his father, says to him, give me that which belongs unto me. Give me mine inheritance. And for him to ask this is a very disrespectful thing. Now, if the father had decided to retire his business and diversify his assets and divide the harvest to one son and divide the animals to the other son, or whatever people do that have these kind of problems, that's the father's business. But for the son to come up and say, I want what belongs to me that I can only get upon your death, that's a disrespectful thing. In other words, what he's saying is, Father, I'd really rather have your money than have you, and I wish you were dead. Whew. Not a cute little story anymore, is it? I mean, we're talking about disrespect to the highest level. People look at this generation around us and say, oh, wow, we ain't never seen disrespect like this. You ever read the Bible? The disrespect been around since the foundation of the world. You remember what the Lord said in Ezekiel 16 to the nation of Israel? He says, your nativity, your day of your birth was as this. You were cast out in the day that you were born, cast out in the field, trodden underfoot. But I came by, I spread my skirt over you, I spoke love and I spoke life to you, and I created you and made you a beautiful person. That's Ezekiel 16. He says, but you've taken everything I've given to you and you've now traded it to the world. In other words, Israel began to act like this prodigal son, saying, we want what God has given to us, we just wish he was dead. Because really that's the backbone of atheism, and that's the backbone of a lot of pagan cultures is, if we can kill God, then we can do whatever we want to. See, if I kill God, I get to make my own morality. If we can kill God, I get to make my own rules. If we can kill God and get rid of him, then this guilt that I'm feeling for being a sinner might go away. And it never will. So the father divides unto both sons his inheritance, and the younger son says here in verse 13 of Luke 15 that the younger son gathered all together and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance with riotous living. Now, there's not enough time left in this short 3-hour presentation that I have to tell you or make all the connections between this and Abraham and that and the other. But the Bible tells us in Genesis 12 that Abraham goes down into Egypt, and then he comes up out of Egypt, and he brings Sarah with him, and there was another little dude that went down there with them, his nephew Lot. Right? Well, when Abraham and nephew Lot have their split and their problems there in the next chapter, it says that Lot pitched his tents toward the city of Sodom. Remember that? And the Bible specifically tells us that he pitched his tents towards the well-watered plains. See, if you've just come through a famine, the one thing that you want is assurance. I'm not going through that garbage again. I want something that's sure, and I want something well-watered. And the Bible tells us that those plains of Sodom were very beautiful, very lovely, like the land of Egypt. The Bible's very specific there when it says, just like Egypt. You know what Lot did? Lot got down in Egypt, and he got a taste of what the world was like, and he liked it. So when he was given a decision, trust God or do your own thing, he said, I kind of like what I'm seeing here. And he pitched his tent toward Sodom. And then the next thing we find out about Lot, he's down in Sodom. So he got this taste for the world. And he chased it. And it's the old adage that you can bring the man out of Egypt, but you can't take the Egypt out of the man. Sometimes somebody will ask me, do you do a thing? Take your pick on what that question is. Do you ride bicycles? Do you fly kites? Do you climb mountains? Do you smoke cigarettes? Do you drink beer? What do you do a thing? And you might say, well, no, I don't. Well, why not? What's wrong with it? Don't you like it? It's not that I don't like it. I'm afraid I will like it. See, sometimes in life, we don't need to be afraid of things we don't like. We need to be afraid of some of the things we will like. And Lot found out how much he liked certain things. And this young man took his living and he went and spent it in a foreign country. And notice what it says here. Verse 14. Listen, 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 listen. And when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in the land. And he began to be in want. I know what I'll do. I'll fix my problem. And I'll go and join myself, verse 15, to a citizen of that country. And he sent him into his fields to feed swine. I thought there was a famine in the land. If there's a famine in the land, why ain't you eating them hogs? Because you know where the famine is? Famine's in his land. See, you can be in a famine, and nobody else is. There are some people in this world who are broke. And there are some people in this world who are poor. And they're broke because of poor decisions. They're not broke because the world is against them. Though I will agree that in Ruth chapter 1, there was a famine in the land. It says now in the time of the judges, there was a famine in the land. This steps over into the area of conspiracy as to whether or not governments are creating famines and creating hardships and things like that. I'm going to leave that with y'all. But this is very specific. There was a famine in his land. There was a famine in his life. And in some cases, it was a famine of his own making. Let me kind of wrap this up a little bit and try and make somewhat of an application to us. Turn with me, please, to the book of Amos, chapter 8. In the book of Amos, chapter 8, we find another reference to famines in the land. He says in Amos chapter 8 and verse 11, "Behold, the days come, saith the Lord. I will send a famine in the land. Not a famine of bread, nor a thirst for water, but of hearing the words of the Lord. And they shall wander from sea to sea, and from north even to east, and they shall run to and fro to seek the word of the Lord, and shall not find it." Wow. Sometimes we think that the best days for the church are all behind us. We may sit and think, is there a famine in our church. Does anyone care about the church anymore? I look sometimes and I see that things have dwindled. I look sometimes and I see that things are not where they used to be. I think I've got enough sense right now to ask the Lord, is it I that am the problem? You know, the Lord said to his disciples, one of you this night shall betray me. The disciples all looked and said, is it I? I'm glad they said that. I can just imagine those disciples right there going to say, Peter, told you, don't be you, you big dummy. Or, hey, Luke, look out, look out. Hey, nobody trusts a tax person over here, Matthew. You know, you're going to get yours in the end. I can just see that fight breaking out right there at the table. So then, if there's a famine in the land, sometimes it's easy to look, as Abraham did, down into Egypt and look for the answers to our problems in the world around us. Well, Egypt had the answer to Abraham's problem for a while. And Egypt solved Abraham's problem for a while. But the way that the whole thing turned out made his whole family suffer. If there is indeed a famine or drought in our church, if there is a famine in our land, I assure you, the world does not have the answer for it. There is only one source of sustenance, and there is only one source to uphold us, and there is only one source to keep us from dying. And it is not the methods of the world, and that is not self-promotion. That is not coming up with a new plan or a new scheme or 5 ways to grow your church. The only thing that's going to keep this church afloat is Almighty God. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is, how long will it take as this prodigal son goes down to feed swine? You know, this Jew feeding swine was a humiliating thing. Y'all ever think about concepts like that? This is a Jew feeding swine. It's about as ridiculous as having a Christmas ham. Now, I'm not shooting at anybody, but I mean, can you imagine? It's Jesus' birthday. What are you doing? We're going to cook a nice hog for that good little Jewish boy. Eventually, it says that he came to himself. And he realized that in his father's house there was bread enough to spare, and I perished with hunger. I will arise and go to my father. I know he plans out this nice little speech here in Luke 15 and verse 18, but you know, that first little statement is really where it begins. He says, I will arise and I will go to my father, and I will speak to him. And I will be satisfied, essentially, with whatever he chooses to do. There might be a famine in the land. There might be a famine in this church. There might be a famine in your own heart. That's why we put that sign downstairs on the board that if everybody treated the church the same way I treat the church, what kind of church would we have? That's a serious question. That's not just some little ditty I came up with. If everybody treats the church the same way I treat the church, what kind of church would we have? You have to ask yourself what kind of church you want to have. And treat it in the same manner. Thankful God blessed Abraham. He blessed Isaac. He blessed Joseph to bless Jacob. Because in Genesis 42 it tells us that a famine was in the land. It had also come up to the land of Canaan. And he went down. He saw his son, and there was a great blessing. He should have gone back to where he came from. But he stayed. And his family stayed another 400 years. And it was a problem. But that's a story for another time. If we think there's a famine in the land, first place we need to go is Almighty God. Thank you for your good attention.